2, 3, 4, 5. This is a meeting of the membership on Wednesday, May the 9th, 2001, at Good of Israel Synagogue in the small chapel.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Mr. Israel Shinder, who is well known to all of you, having been a member of Agudath Israel for many years and having spent most of his extracurricular time working towards the benefit of all of us on the cemeteries in Ottawa. Some of his many responsibilities regarding the cemeteries over the past 3 decades include being the chair of the search committee for the new cemetery and being its chairman for the first 22 years of its existence. He was also chairman of the Bank Street Cemetery from 1986 to 1995. I have personally benefited from his efforts, having 2 plots at the new cemetery and my family having used 3 plots in the Bank Street Cemetery. I'm sure all of you have or will benefit from his efforts, unless you're immortal. Israel Shinder immigrated to Ottawa from Romania via Montreal in 1930. After finishing school, he joined his father's business, clothing and dry goods. He served our country with the RCAF for 4 years, and after the war rejoined his father's business. In the mid-50s, in conjunction with his late brother-in-law Manny Lightstone, he started his own company, Ambico Limited. Mr. Shinder and his late wife Jenny Greenberg were blessed with 4 children and 8 grandchildren. Now Mr. Shinder has retired from business and is married to Maureen Newton. He hopes that this talk will spark some new interest in the cemeteries. Mr. Shinder.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I wrote this speech last October, and I haven't had to change very much because, fortunately, history does not change. So here goes. From time immemorial, wherever Jews settled, first they would organize a minyan, and next they would arrange a place for burial. It was pretty much that way in the early history of Ottawa Jewry. The earliest record of a cemetery in Ottawa is that there was an organization called the Society of the Sons of Jacob, which is not to be confused with the B'nai Jacob Synagogue, which came along much later. They purchased a piece of land in the Bowlesville Road area in 1886. It was a small piece of land, only 83 by 133 feet. Not much bigger than a single lot for a house. The land was sold to the society by Moses Bilski, who was one of the early settlers of Ottawa. He was involved with it because when that land was sold to Adith Jeshurun in 1897, there was a provision in that sale that gave the Bilski family some special plot privileges in the Bank Street Cemetery. The records of this period are very sketchy. We do know that there was a Bilski family plot in the second section of the Bank Street Cemetery just inside the Bank Street fence. From 1897, with the purchase of the land by Adith Jeshurun from the Society of the Sons of Jacob, all cemetery lands have been controlled exclusively by the various synagogues. It might be interesting to note that Adith Jeshurun, the King Street Shul, was the oldest synagogue, and its charter indicates it was incorporated in 1886. Agudath Achim, the Rita Street Shul, was a breakaway from the Adath Jeshurun synagogue, and it was incorporated in 1902. B'nai Jacob, the James Street Shul, started in 1911, and Marziki Hadass, known as the Murray Street Shul in those days, was incorporated in 1919. Agudath Israel was started in 1936, and Young Israel in 1964, and the Temple, the Reform, was incorporated in 1967. Now it is interesting to note that the Vod was incorporated in 1934, almost 50 years after the first cemetery was opened. The first cemetery purchased by a synagogue was by Adath Jeshurun on June the 8th in 1893 on Bank Street, which was the beginning of synagogue involvement in cemeteries. The record indicates that from 1886 to 1893, there was only one cemetery for the Jews of Ottawa, which was then operated by the Society of the Sons of Jacob. I cannot be sure why the Sons of Jacob sold their piece of land, nor why Adath Jeshurun would want to buy it, but it was purchased on March of 1897, and the Society owned this piece of land for some 11 years. Ultimately, Adath Jeshurun sold that piece of land on the Bowlesville Road to the Crown in 1958. This is where the records are really non-existent. We know that the bodies in that cemetery were exhumed and buried in the Bank Street Cemetery, but we don't know precisely when it was done. Most were reburied in the area of the Granite Gate, which is in the southwest corner of the cemetery, the extreme southwest corner. There is no paper trail to indicate which bodies were exhumed and reburied, but one has to assume that Adath Jeshurun was under great pressure from the National Capital Commission to sell this land, since major roads were developed in that area. I am sure that the rabbinate frowned on this because, halachically, one can only exhume a body if one is going to rebury that body in Israel. The land was sold to the Crown for $1,315. I am presuming the cemetery committee knew that it had little choice and went ahead with the deal because it simply had to. Adath Jeshurun, to go back, bought its first piece of land from the Spratt family on June the 8th of 1893 and kept adding to that land from time to time. The entrance to the cemetery on Bank Street was through the granite gateway in the southwest corner that I just spoke of, and it was built in 1913. At that time, they had no frontage on Bank Street. Subsequently, they acquired parcel after parcel of land as the need arose. Other synagogues, which had much smaller memberships, also acquired land adjacent to the original Adath Jeshurun parcels of land. The cemetery on Bank Street in its present form occupies approximately 14 acres of land. Most of the land was owned by the Spratt family, who are still in the sand and gravel business. In 1940, some of the people involved with cemetery were Laz Greenberg, who was an older brother to Yale, who some of you knew, Ben Goldfield, KC, a lawyer, Sam Lepovsky, another lawyer, Alex Betcherman, some of you knew him, Bernard Pearl, who was a civil servant, Meyer Drazen, who was an insurance broker, and the Reverend Avraham Baker, who was the chazan for Marziki Hadass. M.R. Friedman, the father of our chairman, Saul Tanner, and Harry Lakin. It appears that each cemetery took care of its own maintenance. It consisted mostly of watering the grass and keeping it trim. The first record we have of a combined maintenance on Bank Street were the minutes of a meeting which took place on April the 4th, 1949. 5 synagogues were represented. The total cost of maintenance for that year was $2,200, and they agreed to share the cost of maintenance on the percentage of occupancy. Congregation Adas Jeshurun, the King Street Shul, owned at that time 35% of the land. Agudath Achim, the Rita Street Shul, owned 25% of the land. Marziki Hadass, 17% of the land. B'nai Jacob, the James Street Shul, owned 14% of the land, and Agudath Israel owned 9% of the land. That meeting was chaired by Sam Kaplan, and in attendance were Mr. M. Cooper, Label Blowstein, Meyer Drazen, Hy Gould, Sam Lepovsky, KC, M. Lobel, and I. Zelnick. I am reporting this minute in some detail because that principle of sharing costs was disputed just a few years ago, and I shall come back to it. For the record today, if you add up the land owned by Adas Jeshurun, Agudath Achim, and B'nai Jacob, which Beth Shalom acquired when these synagogues amalgamated, it comes to exactly the same 74% which Beth Shalom now owns. Marziki still owns 17%, and Agudath still owns 9%. This arrangement of splitting costs remained in place until 1976. At that time, Beth Shalom appealed to the Cemetery Committee. It asked for consideration. Since it wanted to join in the formation of the new cemetery on an equal basis, but knew full well that it would not require the land in the new cemetery for many, many years to come. They negotiated with Agudath Israel to help with the maintenance costs of the old cemetery. A deal was struck, and Agudath agreed to pick up 25% of the costs of maintenance, leaving 60% for Beth Shalom and 15% for Marziki Hadass. And this arrangement was in place until 1994, quite recently. In 1994, Beth Shalom decided that the sharing of expenses on the basis of land occupied was unfair and stopped contributing to the general maintenance fund. The result of that difficulty has still not been resolved. From that time until the present time, each synagogue on Bank Street Cemetery is taking care of its own maintenance. However, maintenance on the new cemetery is still continuing on an equal basis, and all costs are being shared equally by the 5 synagogues involved. From 1972 until 1994, there was an overall manager of all maintenance who responded to all synagogues for grave digging and flower arrangement, as well as being responsible for grass cuttings, watering, and general maintenance. The first one we had was Nathan Marcus as overall manager, and then his brother Sam took over after Nathan died. And when Sam retired, they sold the business to Fred Leclerc. General maintenance costs such as grass cutting, watering, well maintenance was shared on the pro rata basis of land occupied as it was worked out in 1949 and 1976. This system worked very well for a very long time. I must tell you that when I first became involved with cemetery work for Agudath Israel, there was no overall plan or drawings of the cemetery. Each synagogue had a sketch of its section with graves marked and which empty plots were available. If a death was reported, it was up to the chairman of the cemetery of each synagogue to sell the family a plot, usually the night before burial. If the family already had a plot, at least that chore was eliminated. In any case, it was the duty of the cemetery chairman of that shul, flashlight in hand, winter or summer, to meet with a grave digger around 6 o'clock in the morning and point out the exact location where that grave was to be dug. 6 o'clock in the morning on a cold winter day in the cemetery is an experience which drove most people away from cemetery work. It must be noted that halachically one must not dig a grave in advance of the day of the funeral. That's why we had to be out there that very morning. In 1972 or 1973, Nathan Marcus retired from the City of Ottawa Tree Department to become the overall manager of the cemetery. He undertook to prepare drawings of the whole cemetery, and he accurately indicated empty plots and numbered each section, each row, and each plot. From that time to this day, we are using the drawings he prepared, and all we need do today is to indicate the section of the cemetery, the row, the plot number, to have a grave dug. And that's progress compared to getting up there at 6 o'clock in the morning. We also permitted Nathan Marcus to build greenhouses at his expense, and he undertook to serve the cemetery with flowers for the graves. It was a great arrangement. Flowers are still available, but the cemetery committee is now the vendor, and they contract the placement of flowers. During this period, we worked very closely with the Holocaust Committee, and we allocated land for them in front of the small block building and allowed them to put up their monument in May of 1978. We helped with the erection of the foundation. There is an endowment set up by the Holocaust Committee whereby the maintenance of the lawn and flowers around the monument is paid for annually from the proceeds of that small endowment. Speaking of perpetuity, we were forced by popular demand into providing flowers for graves in perpetuity. It is a long, long story how we got there, but a system is now in place by some of the synagogues where one can pay for perpetual care of flowers. I know Mayor Alvo is trying to make this a project of the General Cemetery Committee, instead of it being administered by the individual synagogues. There's an annual memorial service the first Sunday preceding Rosh Hashanah, and this service has been in place for a very long time. It is a simple service with psalms read by a member of each synagogue and a short sermon by a rabbi from one of the 5 synagogues on a rotation basis. The Gabbai of the Chevra Kadisha is asked to recite the Kaddish, and it is a nice, short, meaningful service. I wish to thank Hai Bloom publicly for donating his services by setting up the sound system for this program every year for as long as I can remember. Some of the people who worked very hard on cemetery matters just a few years before I became involved are acknowledged here. For Agudath Israel, there was Manny Galat and Henry Pass. The general chairman at that time was Meyer Drazen. From Hazikia Das, there was Label Blostein. For B'nai Jacob, there was M. Lobel. Hai Gould became the general chairman of the old cemetery in 1963. He took over after the death of Meyer Drazen. Meyer was chairman from 1943 to 1963. He served 20 years. I became involved with cemetery work in 1970. After many years of service to Agudath Israel as chairman of cemetery, Henry Pass wanted to resign from the job, but could not find anyone to replace him. I told him at that time that if he would hang on until I became ex-president of the shul, and I was president from 1968 to 1970, that if he would just hang on, I would take his place. Well, since I had been in sales all my life, I started promoting and selling cemetery plots, and as the shul was growing rapidly, we were soon out of land in the old cemetery. At that time, Beth Shalom was the largest shul in town and had acquired all the land of the former Adath Jeshurun, of Agudath Achim, and of course by B'nai Jacob. In 1973, Beth Shalom had approximately 6,000 empty plots. One wonders today why they wanted to join in as partner of the new cemetery, since to this day they have still not sold one plot in the new cemetery. It was because of the urgent need of a Agudath Israel synagogue to acquire cemetery land that the new cemetery idea was promoted. Beth Shalom at that time would not consider selling any of its land to Agudath or to anyone else. A search committee was formed to look for land and to organize a format of ownership. Temple Israel, the Reform group, were interested. They had no land at all. Young Israel was interested, and so was Machziki Adas. And Beth Shalom decided to come along. I was appointed chairman of the search committee in 1973, and we must have looked at a dozen sites before we picked up the 60 acres of land in the Osgood Township. We agreed to operate the new cemetery on an equal cost-sharing basis. Each of the 5 synagogues was to own 20% of the land. The cost of development was $100,000, which included professional help, roads, grading, seeding, and a well and a water system. In addition, the cost of the land was $60,000. Demographically, we planned the cemetery to be in use for at least 100 years. Developing a new cemetery requires a whole series of preconditions. The purchase of a piece of suitable land must be a reasonable distance from the city and, of course, affordable. For instance, if you have a funeral on a Friday afternoon in the wintertime, you must have sufficient daylight time to be able to return from the cemetery to your home before Sabbath sets in. The soil must be suitable for burial. You cannot have heavy clay or rocky soil, and there must be a reasonable water table level in the spring, since you would not want to bury anyone in a pool of water. You must get the land rezoned to cemetery land. Our land was zoned farmland at the time of purchase. I am happy to report that the Council of Osgood Township changed the zoning for us at one meeting. I was in and out of there within an hour. Cemetery land is tax-free, and it is sometimes difficult to get the rezoning because it is a curtailment of income to the municipality. You must get clearance from the health department both locally and provincially. They are particularly concerned with drainage and the possibility of pollution to wells in the adjoining area. You must prove the need of the group you represent in order to get a license to bury, and you must agree to conform to all the rules pertaining to burial and cemetery maintenance. In order to check out all these matters, we first took a one-year option on the land for the sum of $5,000, which we would have had to forfeit if we did not purchase the land. Fortunately, all the above conditions fell into place. High Hotchburg and I flew to Toronto to meet with the provincial government, which is the Department of Consumer and Commercial Relations, to finalize all the details. They issued the license to the community and would not consider dealing with the 5 synagogues. We had no difficulty with that bit of red tape. They wanted responsible people to deal with, and I guess we proved that we were responsible. We did a lot of work to develop the new cemetery. The layout of the roads contain each section so that halachically each section is an entity unto itself. The halachic rules were worked out between Rabbi Bolka, Rabbi Friedberg, and Rabbi Gerber, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. A signed document of these decisions is on cemetery files. A Kohen is permitted to walk through any of the roads in the new cemetery without infringing on his religious commitment. Each section is permitted to bury its dead as it wishes without requiring permission from the other sections. The Chaver Kadisha were consulted, and it was understood that all burials would be in conformance with the traditional Orthodox rituals. We have to acknowledge that the Reform movement have different rules of who is Jewish, but we have had no problems of any kind. It has always been a very amicable relationship. The land was absolutely bare when we bought it, and we planted trees on the perimeter of each section, as well as on the boulevard and along the front. We did tree plantings every few years and did a lot of the planting with volunteers. We used the bare root method of planting. It was work, but it was fun. It takes a long time for a tree with a 3/4 inch caliber to look like something. But time is on your side. Some of the trees are now 20 years old. Anyone who has been out to the new cemetery will attest to its beautiful layout, its lovely trees, and the beautiful gate and chapel. I wish to acknowledge the generosity of Sidney V. Quinn, who donated the beautiful stone gate to the cemetery and the lovely chapel, which is being used during the wintertime for open graveside burials. The gate was designed by our landscape architect, Don Graham, in 1976, and it was built in 1996, so we waited 20 years for a donor. Some of the people who made it happen in 1973 to 1976. It's a very busy time. We had meetings almost 3 or 4 a month. Some of the people in that planning stage were Harry Hecht, Sam Edelson, Hy Gould, Alex Betcherman, Arnold Lithwick, Max Sternthal, Alfred Friedman, Ed Rosenthal, who was the secretary from the VOD, Hy Hochberg, Dr. Earl Cooperman, Louis Levy, Dr. Norman Tannenbaum, Thomas Sachs, Label Blolstein, Saul Zaslov, Ruben Kalin, Dr. Jason Greenblatt, Joel Deanna, Saul Sherman, and I'm sure I missed a few in that group. The firm of Goldberg Shinder did all the legal work, gratis. We thank them again for their generosity. We opened a new cemetery in November of 1976. It was a great day for the community, and there is a picture of the opening ceremony. Saul Shinder was then president of the VOD, and he officially opened the cemetery. Our ceremony included the burial of old cifretores and damaged or torn prayer books and other religious articles, usually disposed of in this way. It was a cold, gray, windy day, but everyone was excited to participate in this unusual and historic ceremony. There's a picture on the table back there of just how that ceremony went. The big hole is right in front of that picture. During this time, Hy Gould was chairman of the old cemetery, and I became his vice chairman. And he, in turn, became my vice chairman of the new cemetery. We continued in this way for many years until Hy Gould retired in 1986. Well, no one was lined up for his job, and I was persuaded to assume the chairmanship of the old cemetery as well as the new cemetery. He continued to serve on the committee representing Beth Shalom for a number of years. The Chevra Kadisha always worked closely with the various cemetery committees. They were often consulted about cemetery matters, but remained totally independent. Ottawa is one of the few cities in North America that do not have to use a professional undertaker service to bury its dead. It is a tribute to the dedication of the Chevra Kadisha that they have been able to maintain the service to the Ottawa Jewish community. The question has been asked, what role did the VOD play in all this? Well, the VOD in the early days gave the cemeteries a lot of good secretarial help. They did all our accounting and worked with our auditors to prepare financial statements. The synagogues always paid the VOD for these services. Hy Hochberg and Ed Rosenthal were a great help in the organization of the new cemetery. People like Molly Sherman and Keith Jekyll were also professionally and personally committed to cemetery work. As time went on, the VOD's interest dwindled and secretarial service was reduced to an unacceptable level. Today, all secretarial and accounting work is done outside the VOD's jurisdiction. It is noteworthy that the province of Ontario has always had jurisdiction over cemeteries, but today they are much more involved. We are required to give them a percentage of every plot sold, which is now $150 for every single plot. They in turn invest this money into a trust fund for perpetual care, and the earnings of that fund are turned over to us annually to help with maintenance. I do not have the exact figure of the sum of these funds today, but they are quite substantial. In the last few years, they have added another fund, which is added to the cost of each monument. The tax is $100 for a single monument and $200 for a double monument. This assessment is included in the price of the monument, and the monument companies include this $100 and $200 in their price. They in turn this sum back to the cemetery committee, which again is sent on to the Ontario government, and which again is invested, and we get a percentage of that investment to help with monument maintenance. I did not stand for re-election in 1995, and Mayor Alvo was elected chairman of both cemeteries. I served as chairman of the new cemetery from the date of its inception in 1976 until 1995, and I served as chairman of the old cemetery from 1986 to 95. And so the cemetery is an ongoing business. The present chairman, Mayor Alvo, is trying hard to put matters on a more secure financial basis. The facts of life on financing a cemetery is that the more graves in place, the higher the maintenance costs, and the fewer available plots for sale, the less income. Ultimately, there is no income, just maintenance. The present plan is to build up a Zicharon fund, an endowment, which will ultimately grow in sufficient size to help fund the rising costs of maintenance. On the old cemetery, I wish to acknowledge the hard work of Norman Petitian, who took it upon himself to raise a considerable sum of money these last few years. He replaced the fence along Bank Street and put in new roads to every section of the old cemetery. He renovated the block building so that it may now be used for open graveside burials during inclement weather. Many thanks are due to Norman from the Jewish community. To conclude, I found cemetery work interesting and worthwhile, and I hope that the present leadership will have the good fortune to keep things going. Cemeteries are as necessary as life itself. Thank you.
We'll invite questions from the floor. Shirley?
You mentioned that this is probably common knowledge. This is probably common knowledge, but my family hails from Toronto, and since my brother is COVID, he cannot enter the cemetery. He must stand outside, but you're saying that at the new cemetery, the paths allow Kohanim to enter each section.
Mm-hmm.
What about at Bank Street?
On Bank Street, the area that is surrounding the Holocaust Memorial is also neutral territory. And although I see every year people still hang over the fence, as they have always done, that section is permitted as a neutral area, and Kohanim can enter there because there are no dead buried in that section. The halachic rule, as I understand it, is if there's a road anywhere that's at least 20 feet wide, that road represents a neutral territory, and we have made sure that these roads dividing off each section of the new cemetery, so that a person can walk up almost to the very edge if someone is buried in the first or second row, he can be very close to that monument and still be in neutral territory on the road. That's the intent of that halachic ruling.
How come nobody realizes this?
Well, we have said it many times, but people are just not listening. We have made this public many times, and somehow it isn't picked up.
As a member of the Cemetery Commission,
Well,
we've never been in the block.
well, it's a fact of life. It's absolutely correct. Or you can use the path close to the little hut that you come down. Yeah, that's also neutral. Yeah, and that's in the old cemetery. If you walk down the middle of the road, it's usually acceptable in the old cemetery. But in the new cemetery, there's an absolute written ruling, and that ruling can be made public, but it's never been a secret. Yes?
How many units of service, quote, quote, cemetery lots, are there in the new system?
How many in the new cemetery?
Yeah. You said that.
Well, the original first section of the cemetery had approximately 5 times 900, approximately 4,500. And then the second section, of which there's a big dotted line around the map, if I had a map here I'd show you, was again approximately the same number. So that the drawing that is readily available now and is marked out by the original architect would include approximately 9,000 plots altogether.
May I come back?
Sure.
Because there's always something that bothers me. You said in your excellent paper that Beth Shalom had 6,000 plots.
Plots, yeah.
And therefore and you built 9,000 new ones, theoretically.
Yeah. Well, the first section was only 4,500.
4,500. And you said that was the 9,000 was going to last 100 years, you estimated.
No. We're talking. We have 60 acres of land, and what I didn't say in my talk was that this first developmental section is only 6 or 7 acres. So you have a great deal of land that is still undeveloped, but is ready to be developed anytime you need it.
How many deaths are there a year?
I'm told that the average death rate in Ottawa is about 80 to 85 deaths a year.
Let's assume 100. Beth Shalom had 6,000 lots available. Theoretically, there was enough on Bank Street for 40, 50 years, 60 years, theoretically.
But as I said in my talk, they would not consider selling any of their land. They felt that they wanted to keep it for future development, and they wouldn't sell. And so I can tell you unofficially that the reform had a great deal of trouble even buying plots from Beth Shalom at that time, because under the rules of the reform, some of the people that they considered Jewish were not considered Jewish by the other group, and so there was a problem. When we asked them to join us, they were absolutely delighted to come in with us, and we were able to accommodate them because of this road situation. So we've never had a problem with the reform. Always been great. Yes, Jeff. Well, I personally think that they tried to suppress the information because there isn't a trace of information anywhere. I think Shirley will back me up that you've looked and looked and couldn't find anything. Right, Shirley?
Shirley's going to put her foot in her mouth. Actually, when I got involved, one of the first things I thought of doing was writing to all the rabbis who had served the community, and in Rabbi Mission sent back some material that he had gathered because he was going to write a history of the Jewish community in Ottawa. And in his collection, there are pictures of three gravestones, and there were, and so somebody has to go get those pictures and find those gravestones, because when I got them, my immediate assumption was that they were pictures of gravestones that had been moved there. So that's something that we've got to check on. And the other information I had in an oral history interview was that the Stein family had, you might know about this.
No.
The Stein family had erected the gates in the southwest corner, and there were names put on them. We went and checked to see if those were the possible names, but they were very difficult to read.
There were names there. The names on that gate were the people who were active in cemetery work at that time, and we read the names, and they were certainly not. if ever someone really wanted to get into it, one could turn around and check the gravestones, which are mostly in Hebrew, and establish when the date of death was. Because if they died prior to 1893, when the first opening of the Adas Jeshurun cemetery started, if they died prior to that date, then possibly they were buried in the Bowlesville Road Cemetery. But that would take a little research and take some time, and I don't know whether that information can be extracted from the monuments that are there. All I could ever get was I talked to some of the old-timers, and if they knew, they suppressed it, and I gathered that they didn't know, and I don't think there were many, many graves in that old cemetery. I'm just guessing, but I would think if there were a dozen graves, it would be a lot. Because don't forget that that cemetery was really the only cemetery for a very short time, 5 or 6 years. And Ottawa was a very small place for Jews at that time. I don't know what the population would have been, but it couldn't have been very many. And so the number of deaths in those 5 years when this cemetery was open, from, I have the dates here, from 1886 to 93, I think they were the only cemetery for Jews in town. So it couldn't have been many. Yes?
So I know a case in the Beechwood Cemetery. There's somebody buried there with mother dug on a stone. About 1880, 1885.
Well, there may have been a time where there were no Jewish cemeteries, and there were some Jews, and they had to be buried somewhere. I have no record or recollection.
I know there's no record.
Because there was a Star of David on the stone doesn't mean he's a Jewish.
Well, the name indicated very close that he's a real Jew. Like a cone or something.
Because you know, this the old city
Well,
of
no way I can
Toronto
ask.
has a Mountain David on it.
Yes, I really.
Yeah,
Good luck,
yeah.
It's not-
Any other questions?
Prior,
Yes, miss.
prior to the Bank Street.
I'm sorry. Yes.
cemetery, there was supposed to be a small old one on Riverside, right next to the Bronson Avenue Bridge.
Yeah, that's the area.
Well, that's the one.
That's the one I'm talking of.
You mentioned Bowlesville Road.
Well, the Bowlesville Road ran into that area, but that's the area where that old cemetery was. That's definitely the area. Yes, ma'am.
Was it ever contemplated that we might have a second public service at the new cemetery before Rosh Hashanah? I mean, we have a public service every year before the high
Yeah, that's in the
holiday,
old cemetery.
at the old
Right.
cemetery. I just wonder whether this was ever contemplated, that a second service could be held.
There has not been, to my knowledge, any popular demand for a service at the new cemetery. And as I understand it, even the last few years in the old cemetery, a mere handful of people show up. It used to be a more popular thing than it is. But I think the last one, Meyer, you confirmed this, no more than 30, 40 people showed up at the old cemetery that has literally thousands of people buried there. So unless there was a popular demand, I'm sure that the cemetery committee would be more than happy to arrange for a service if enough people asked for it.
I see. What is enough, I wonder?
I have no idea, but certainly there has to be more than
More than a million.
more than a million.
More than a million.
Yes, Mark.
How many people are buried in that cemetery today?
In the new cemetery? Oh, there must be at least 200 or more. It would be at least 200.
Can I just get clarification, please? Those 6,000 plots owned by Beth Shalom, are they all in the old cemetery, Bank Street Cemetery?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, those bodies have been moved from Bowlesville. They were reburied, but they didn't rebury them at the monuments. Is that true? Is that the case?
We just don't know, Steve. We have no records, no indication. I'm presuming that I'm making a lot of assumptions simply because I can't imagine Jewish people having their dead exhumed and reburied without paying them the proper respect and without taking whatever monument was there moved over to the new location. The National Capital Commission have been approached a number of times. I think you tried several times, Shirley, and there simply are no records that we could find. So, but I can't imagine Jewish people being exhumed in whatever monument was there. I'm sure the bodies were treated with respect, because we're talking about responsible people in the Cemetery Committee and certainly responsible people in the National Capital Commission. So I'm sure that they were buried with respect, and whatever monuments were on those graves, I'm sure, would have been transferred. But if one wanted to take the time around that corner and take a record of every one of those stones and read the Hebrew and read the dates, we might be able to identify some of those. That's my assumption.
Any other questions? I want to throw a little bit of information, two bits of information that you didn't give us is, one is that the Ottawa branch of the Ontario Genealogical Society in 1993 took an inventory of the Osgood Cemetery, the new Jewish cemetery in Osgood. It's in a booklet form. It's in the archives. We have a copy of it. And in November of 1996, again, the Ottawa branch of the Ontario Genealogical Society did the United Jewish Cemetery on Bank Street. Now, those are an inventory of names. However, because a lot of the names, as stated by Izzy, are in Hebrew, there could be some question as to the exact authenticity of some of the statements. So the Ottawa Jewish Genealogical Society has commenced taking photostats of each stone in both cemeteries. They've done some last year. They'll be doing some more this year, and the two cemeteries will be completed by the end of next year, so that any stones that may have been transferred will be photographed, and then they will have them interpreted. I understand. This was a province-wide thing of which the Ottawa branch took care of the Ottawa section, and it wasn't only to the Jewish cemetery that was done. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, I'll ask Mel Goldberg to come. I'm sorry, one more question.
It's not really a question, just a statement. It seems to me that we could do a better job of indicating directions to the new cemetery. There are very few signs of any. It's very difficult. We've never been out there too often. It's very difficult place to get. Seems to me that there could be some signs that help me. Not that I'm anxious to go out there to visit, but necessary.
I wonder if you do anything on that. Directions from the west end of the city and from the east end of the city, because they're different. You can come through Manitou. On the west end, it's much shorter. Straight up Woodruff, 60 and into Manitou to the left.
Let Meyer answer that.
We've got 5,000 pamphlets available that indicate the directions to the new cemetery. We've got a map. We've made those available to the Hebra Kadisha. I've given them to the House Wayfair. Ivan Silverman, I guess, is the one who has many of these. Every synagogue has a copy of these. I'll be more than happy to give you a few.
Have you one on permanent display of Cuba? Because I think that's what most need.
As I said, I've given them to the Hebra. They do them when they are
Cuba. Should be on permanent display in the lobby. We rely on that. They have them on this.
There's one other problem. Excuse me. There's one other problem in that the Ontario Highway Commission will not permit signs of cemeteries on their roads, and we have sneaked a few small signs here and there, but they are really against any signs being put up for cemeteries.
We have signs on the road that lead
To the chapel.
Osgood site, as well. We have to negotiate with the province, and they're now in place. They've been there. In fact, it was very difficult to get a different sign made for Jewish cemeteries. The one that we have now has a Magen David, and they've never had this before. That's on the road.
Norm, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to comment, we have any maps and directions that are placed in the lobby of the Cuba, placed in the lobby of every Cuba.
Are there any other questions? Yes?
I was wondering if you could give your comments on your opinion on the future of the synagogue model of running the cemeteries based on your years of experience and seeing the ups and downs of synagogues differing from each other when it comes to issues like portion of land or paying for cemetery maintenance. How do you feel about that?
Well, that's a big question. I really don't know whether I can comment on that. I know the problems we've had, and I know that my mayor is working very actively now on changing many things around, and those changes are just in the planning stage and just being implemented. So what the future of all this will be, I don't know. But the facts of life in cemetery is always, and we can take our cue from other communities in North America, and that is after cemeteries become filled up, and you're looking at survivors in the second and third and fourth generation sometimes in America, unless the community turns around and takes an interest in maintaining these cemeteries, they simply become overgrown and abandoned. We hope that will never happen here, but this is a much different community than, say, New York or Boston or Los Angeles. But you have to recognize that as these cemeteries fill up, the relationships get very far away. When you're looking in some cities in the U.S. where you have fourth generation, fifth generation children, people that are buried, they've lost contact. Some of them don't know, some of them don't want to know, but it's a problem. I think in Ottawa we're a much more closely knit community, and one way or another I think our greatest hope is to build up a good, healthy Zicharon fund with a decent endowment. We could easily maintain cemeteries in perpetuity, because then we wouldn't be dependent on this synagogue or that synagogue, because synagogues too have a life of their own. Some survive and some don't. So it's a community thing, and the community at some point or another has to step in and literally take over if the synagogues themselves don't have the means to perpetuate this work. Does that answer your question? I hope so. Thank you.
Yes, that's a related question. I hope it was. Is there anything concerning ongoing maintenance of old cemeteries in the Ontario Cemetery Act? What is there a legal obligation on the part of an organization to make sure that it meets government requirements concerning ongoing maintenance? Do you know?
Well, the Department of Consumer and Commercial Relations have taken a big step. This was about 25 years ago when they started forcing a certain amount of money to be turned over to them for every plot sold. Now, I don't know the exact amount of money that's been gathered, but I suspect on the Bank Street Cemetery there's well over $100,000 in that fund, which unfortunately today doesn't generate a great deal of money. I mean, if you're getting a 5-6% return on your money today, you're doing pretty good. So they have tried. Now, they can't force anybody to do anything, but they are trying to help out by making this money from this endowment, if you like, available to cemetery groups to help with the maintenance. And it doesn't come close to paying for the cost of maintaining the cemetery as we would like it. But regardless of our problems, we have maintained the cemeteries in beautiful condition. So one way or another, we're we're pulling our way through, and I think we will continue to do so. I'm sure that this new committee that's working on building up a good, strong endowment is the answer to making sure that there will always be funds to take care of this cemetery property.
Any further questions? Okay, Mel Goldberg, will you come forward, please? Just wait.
The Ottawa Jewish Historical Society has once again come up with a winner. We are the only place that you can hear not only about the past, but the people who remember the past and who have lived the past. In Izzy, we have one of the real stalwarts of the community. I had the pleasure of serving as a Neguda's representative under Izzy for several years on the cemetery committee. Nobody was more indefatigable. No one was more devoted to the needs of the community than Izzy Shinder. He talked about the new cemetery that we opened. I am proud to say, although perhaps with a shudder, that there's a picture of one person digging a hole for a tree at the new synagogue is on the table. And I won't tell you who it is, but his initials are Mel Goldberg. And you will see there the spirit that has invigorated this community and invigorated the establishment of this cemetery throughout the years. Izzy, no one could have done a better job, and we are very grateful.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Mel. I'm sorry. Okay, announcement's coming. I know what it is.
You're right. We're going to have the real history happening. Professor Cochler is with Minister Manley in Israel right now, talking to the Arabs. He will be talking to the Ottawa Post of the Jewish War Veterans of Canada a week today at Matziki Hadass. It's a dinner. It's open to the community. And if you want to get the word of Israel hot off the press, this is your opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, remember a meeting next month and September the 9th in the afternoon. Refreshments are in the back of the room. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Great job. Yeah.